Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really vital exploration. It's about a subject that demands our full attention. The complex and often, let's be honest, overwhelming mental health landscape facing children and adolescents right here in Canada. And we're jumping right into the source material today. The numbers are just too critical to delay. Our deep dive reveals this shocking snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
1 in 5 children and adolescents in Canada suffer from a major mental illness. That's significant enough to cause real problems
Yeah.
at home, at school, in their social lives.
Yeah, real impairments.
Exactly. And if you dig a bit deeper into the diagnostic criteria, you find about 13% of Canadian youth meet the criteria for at least one full mental disorder. This isn't, a distant problem. It's a massive, immediate crisis happening right now.
And it's immediately clear, looking at those numbers, that the sheer volume, well, that's only part of the story. The real urgency comes from the outcomes.
Right.
If you connect this to the bigger public health picture, the sources point to suicide as the leading cause of death among children and youth aged 10 to 19.
That just stops you in your tracks.
It really should. And yet, when you look at the actual care being delivered, well, it's frankly a heartbreaking failure. 2/3 of children and youth identified with mental health problems are not getting any treatment.
2/3.
None at all. That huge treatment gap, that's the system failing at a fundamental level.
The failure rate, that 2/3 figure, it just highlights why this mission today is so crucial. We need to distill this massive challenge into something actionable for you, the listener. So our goal today is kind of threefold. First, we have to confront the systemic inequities that are driving those shocking stats. Second, we need to understand the roots, the triggers of these disorders, especially the role of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Which are so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, we need to clearly distinguish between some common diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder versus conduct disorder, and look at the evidence-based, culturally safe ways we can intervene.
Okay, so let's start where the problem often hides. In the system itself, our sources actually call stigma a silent public health epidemic.
Yeah.
For way too long, the mental health needs of Canadian youth were just overlooked, treated as somehow less urgent than physical problems.
That's absolutely true. And that historical neglect, it just compounds exponentially when you layer in systemic inequity. It really makes you ask, who's suffering? Have we been willing to tolerate?
Wow.
The sources detail this profoundly disproportionate burden on Indigenous youth. We know sort of generally that suicide rates are 5 to 6 times higher in Aboriginal communities overall.
But it gets even starker when you zoom in, doesn't it? I'm thinking about that data from Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
It highlights that young Indigenous girls are, it's horrifying, 29 times more likely to commit suicide compared to their non-Indigenous peers.
29 times. When you hear a number like that, you realize this is way beyond individual struggle.
Yeah.
You're staring right into a historical and systemic failure.
That 29-time statistic, it reflects decades of trauma, of neglect, just baked into every system that touches these children's lives. It's really no coincidence that the data also reports 80% of children and youth in care in Saskatchewan are Indigenous.
80%.
Yeah. That intersection of trauma, being in the care system, and ethnic disparity, it creates this perfect storm of vulnerability.
And this feeds right into the critique in that 2022 Desperately Waiting report. The findings paint this picture of a system that's just overwhelmingly reactive.
Reacting to crisis.
Exactly. Responding only when a child hits a crisis point instead of being proactive with early supports, with prevention.
Yeah.
And if we talk about access, well, it's dire. Youth in remote communities waiting up to 2 years just to see child psychiatric services.
2 years. Waiting 2 years for specialist help when you're a child who's struggling, maybe having suicidal thoughts, and suicide is the leading cause of death for your age group. That wait time is just, it's intolerable.
It means the system is broken.
It means it's structurally incapable of meeting the urgency of the problem. Yeah.
So if the system is failing like this, what does the response need to look like, according to the sources? How do we build that equity and access?
Well, it requires a really intentional shift towards providing culturally safe care. And that means care that recognizes, that respects the patient's cultural background, their historical trauma, their personal context. It's got to go beyond just, cultural competence.
Okay.
The research points to things like Jordan's Principle. That ensures First Nations children get the health, social, and educational supports they need without delays because of jurisdictional fights. This whole approach, it's intrinsically linked to fulfilling the spirit, the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving from systemic access to individual risk. Let's look at the roots, the triggers of these disorders. We know there's a mix, right? Biological factor.
Sure, genetic links.
Yeah, genetic links implicated in things like autism, bipolar,
Yeah.
ADHD, and psychological factors too, like a person's basic temperament, how they regulate emotions, their resilience.
Right.
But here's where it gets really critical for our listener, I think, the environmental factors. Specifically, adverse childhood experiences,
Yeah.
ACEs. These seem to be the key pieces that can turn that genetic vulnerability into an actual diagnosed condition.
Yeah, the focus on ACEs is absolutely crucial because they provide this direct, scientifically proven link between early trauma and poor long-term health outcomes. We define ACEs as potentially traumatic events that happen in childhood, so from birth up to age 17.
Okay.
And what stood out in the research for me was how clearly these experiences are categorized. It really shows the breadth of what we mean by developmental trauma.
So can you lay out those three main categories for us?
Yeah, they fall into first, abuse. That includes physical, emotional, or sexual harm. Pretty clear. Second, neglect. And this covers both physical neglect, like not enough food or shelter, and also emotional neglect, which is that lack of affection, love, or emotional support.
That emotional piece feels really important.
It's huge. And third, and this one's often overlooked, is household dysfunction.
Household dysfunction. What are the common examples there? It sounds like, well, chaos at home.
Exactly. It's the chaos and the chronic stress. So this includes living with parents who have substance use issues or serious mental illness, witnessing domestic violence, having a family member incarcerated, or going through a really severe high-conflict parental separation or divorce. These aren't just, single bad events. There are chronic stressors that fundamentally reshape a child's world.
That paints a picture of just constant systemic stress for a kid and the impact. It sounds devastating,
Yeah.
extending way beyond just anxiety or depression.
Precisely. We know these ACEs lead directly to a higher risk for mood disorders, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and also behavioral risks like self-harm. But the physiological impact is just as profound.
How so?
Well, that constant activation of the stress response system, it actually alters neurodevelopment. It changes the brain, and it makes the child more vulnerable to chronic illnesses later in life, heart disease, obesity, diabetes. This is why looking at mental health really has to be seen as preventative physical health care, too.
That connection is so important. So, if that's the risk profile ACEs create, what about the protective factors? What does a mentally healthy child or adolescent actually look like, according to the sources?
Well, they're typically characterized by a few core strengths, things like the ability to trust, to feel safe with their main caregivers, and also with their peers, possessing a positive but also realistic self-concept, and really importantly, having the capacity to cope with the normal, age-appropriate stresses that life inevitably throws at them.
This is the everyday stuff.
The everyday stuff. They can maintain creative thinking, they can develop and keep healthy relationships. These foundational abilities, you see, are exactly what trauma tries to erode.
Okay, let's pivot now to some specific common diagnoses.
Yeah.
Starting with those disruptive behaviors, it feels really crucial for anyone working with youth or parents to understand the precise difference between oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, and conduct disorder, CD. Because the path forward, the prognosis for each, it's very different.
Absolutely. The line drawn between ODD and CD, it really comes down to the severity of the behavior, and it centers on whether rights are being violated.
Okay.
So ODD involves this persistent pattern of angry, irritable mood, lots of defiance, argumentativeness, maybe vindictiveness. They refuse rules, they blame others, they're constantly testing limits with authority figures.
Right.
But the key detail is that ODD does not involve seriously violating the basic rights of others. Think of it like defiance directed up the hierarchy, a frustrated kid yelling at a teacher, maybe.
Okay, so ODD is defiance, maybe emotional dysregulation, but kind of within certain boundaries, whereas conduct disorder, that crosses the line entirely. It moves from challenging authority to actually causing harm.
That's exactly right. Spot on. Conduct disorder is a repetitive, persistent pattern of behavior that violates the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms or rules. If ODD is like a power struggle, CD involves aggression and harm. The sources group these violations into four main types: aggression towards people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious rule violations like chronic truancy, running away.
That distinction is so vital because CD carries that specific, serious long-term risk, doesn't it?
It does. Individuals diagnosed with conduct disorder are at significantly increased risk for developing antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. That makes early effective intervention absolutely critical.
Okay, Let's move to neurodevelopmental disorders. Let's talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Our sources say it's the most frequently occurring psychiatric disorder of childhood worldwide, affecting a huge range, 5 to 12% of school-aged kids.
Yeah, it's very common. And what really stood out in the research about ADHD is the staggering rate of comorbidity, meaning having other disorders alongside it.
Ah, right.
Only about 20% of ADHD cases are just ADHD. The other 80% are complicated by other disorders. Oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, occurs in about 50% of ADHD cases. Anxiety in 30%, mood disorders in 25%. This huge overlap is why diagnosis can be, well, a really complex, multi-layered process.
And we absolutely have to talk about the gender bias here. The identified male-to-female ratio is about 2 to 1, maybe higher in some studies, but the research consistently says girls are significantly underidentified and underdiagnosed.
This is such a classic example of diagnostic criteria being maybe unintentionally tailored to the more disruptive presentation, which is just more common in boys.
The hyperactive part.
Exactly. Boys often get identified maybe 3 times more frequently because of hyperactivity, the externalized symptoms that are hard to miss in a classroom. Girls, though, they more often present with the inattentive type. It's quieter.
So what does that look like?
They might be daydreaming, seem disorganized, struggle internally with focus, but their symptoms are less disruptive to others, and so they often get missed. It's a huge equity issue in diagnosis.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and finally, just quickly covering autism spectrum disorder, ASD. The Canadian infographic source cited reveals that an estimated 1 in 66 Canadian children and youth, ages 5 to 17, have received an ASD diagnosis.
And similar to ADHD, we see a pronounced gender disparity there too, again highlighting how complex it is to identify symptoms across genders. Males were identified 4 times more frequently than females, about 1 in 42 males compared to 1 in 165 females.
All right, so when we transition to treatment, the sources seem crystal clear on the philosophy for kids and teens. Medication is generally not the first thing you reach for.
That's right, not the first line of defense.
The research strongly suggests that pharmacology, if and when it's used, is best combined with other established treatments. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or maybe family therapy.
Yeah, that research on multimodal treatment is honestly one of the most important takeaways from this whole deep dive, I think. Look at the ADHD example again.
Okay.
The sources make it really clear that the most robust, the most long-lasting treatment response comes when you combine medication with cognitive or behavioral interventions. And here's the critical point. Medication treatment alone was found to be no better than a placebo group.
Wow, no better than placebo.
No better. That really underscores that successful pediatric mental health treatment is about building skills, modifying behavior, supporting the child's environment, not just, chemically managing symptoms.
So beyond medication, what kinds of effective non-drug interventions are we seeing?
Oh, a wide range. Family therapy is huge. CBT, as you mentioned, play therapy, especially for younger kids. Even using therapeutic tools like drawing or music can be really effective. Our sources even give some practical communication tips and tricks for parents and caregivers.
Like what?
Well, simple strategies that can make a big difference at home. Things like using age-appropriate language, obviously. Always trying to offer choices to support the child's sense of autonomy. And crucially, learning to validate their feelings before you try to correct their behavior.
Validate first.
Validate first. For a younger child, you might use play or drawing to help them explore feelings they can't quite articulate yet. For teenagers, a specific tip was to avoid asking those closed yes-no questions. Try to ask open-ended questions to encourage more communication about what they're actually experiencing.
That makes sense. Okay, let's pivot to one last really crucial distinction, one that often causes a lot of confusion and fear. Non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI, often just called self-harm. Our sources emphasize that this behavior is distinct from a suicide attempt. Understanding that difference is vital.
That distinction is paramount. Absolutely critical. The goal of NSSI is usually not to die. It's fundamentally a coping mechanism, an attempt, albeit a harmful one, to manage overwhelming emotions.
And it's widespread.
It is. Almost 2 in 10 Canadian youth aged 14 to 21 reported self-harm behaviors, and it's about twice as common in girls and young women.
So if the goal isn't death, why? Why is the child or teen doing it? What function does it serve for them?
Well, the underlying goal is usually about managing distress, coping with intense stress. The reasons cited kind of fall into a couple of categories. Sometimes it's used to get relief from really intense, distressing emotional feelings, like a way to let the pressure out.
Okay.
Other times, paradoxically maybe, it's used to deal with numbness or detachment, to feel anything when they feel completely empty or dissociated. And sometimes it can be a way of communicating severe, unmanageable pain and distress to others when they don't have the words.
That reframing is incredibly powerful. So the underlying goals, relief, communication, feeling grounded, there was actually healthy needs or desires. It's just that self-harm is the dangerous, unhealthy way the young person is trying to meet those needs.
Exactly, you've got it. So when responding to NSSI, the focus really needs to be on validating the distress the child is clearly experiencing and then collaboratively building a safety plan, working with them to find healthier tools to meet those underlying needs, rather than just focusing solely on punishing or stopping the behavior itself. Hashtag outro.
Wow. This has been a really dense but incredibly necessary deep dive. We've covered so much ground. The statistical urgency that 1 in 5 Canadian youth impacted, the absolute necessity of an equity framework driven by things like Jordan's principle,
Mm-hmm.
the foundational role of adverse childhood experiences in shaping lifelong health, and the critical importance of integrated, trauma-informed care over those siloed, often medication-first approaches.
And if we just connect all that back to the bigger picture, the life cycle of health, the data is just undeniable. A striking 80% of adults who have a diagnosed mental illness report experiencing their first symptoms during adolescence or even mid to late childhood.
80%.
80%. So the quality of the support, the interventions received during youth, it really does determine the trajectory of adult mental health.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If 80% of adult mental illness truly begins in youth, what responsibility does that place on our systems? Health, education, social services. What's their responsibility to proactively fund and implement the kind of comprehensive, culturally safe care strategies we've discussed before? These disruptive disorders potentially become chronic adult conditions.
Yeah.
Think about your own immediate sphere of influence, your work, your community, maybe even your family. What's one small, targeted action you could take, starting today, to support better early detection or a more trauma-informed response for the young people around you?